Are you on here?
Okay, well, I am Lyle, and I am a grateful recovered alcoholic. Uh, and I learned that verbiage from the big book and from my sponsor. I got to tell you, it was a long road to get there. Um, I knew early on that I didn't do well with alcohol or other substances. I had a what we hear all the time, a less than ideal environment, and so I left home at 13 years old. Uh, I was told I had to pay rent, and I thought if I was going to pay rent, I'd pay it somewhere I actually wanted to be. And that worked out about as well as you'd think, a 13-year-old on his own making decisions 13-year-olds make. And it actually went okay for a while. I was probably more responsible from 13 to 16 than I was from 30 to 36 anyway. So I finished high school and did well, was working a good job, making more money than was probably healthy for me at that age. But starting in junior high, I was hanging with the folks that I fit in with, which were the ones that didn't fit in with anybody, and I'm sure you guys know that story. And just heading all the wrong directions, and still doing well in school, but just kind of lost. Just trying my best to figure out what life was about, and I thought it was about working and making money, and that held up for a while. Then when I was 16, I had a pivotal event. I was very angry. I had had an abusive childhood, so I was just an angry person. I didn't know I was angry, but I was. If I saw a group of guys picking on a smaller guy, I wanted to go clean house, and not in the way that we know here in AA. And it wasn't, I was crazy enough that they were afraid of me, even if they were bigger than me. So just that total unhealthy lack of fear. But I didn't realize it was my own anger. I thought I was the knight in shining armor. If I saw a guy hit a girl, I'd take care of the guy, and later on, I learned that I was taking my anger out on others. I thought it was fine because I was taking it out on people that I thought deserved it. But it was going to end up where I was either going to be dead or in jail. There was no doubt that was the direction I was headed. But then both what many will say would be the worst thing, but also one of the best things that ever happened is that at 16, I was abducted by a homicidal necrophiliac. That's just big words for saying he liked to have sex with dead people. And was accused of, never proven, of killing quite a few people. But long story short, I was handcuffed, taken out to the Everglades, and tortured for a period of time, and raped and left for dead out there. I did survive, obviously, so there's a bonus. And glad I did. But in that process, I cried out to God in a way that I never had, and He answered. And so that's all good. And that gentleman, by the way, that was in the mid 70s, and he's still incarcerated today. But what happened was I learned forgiveness in that process. I also learned the total lack of control. I learned that I wasn't the one in charge of everything. I had always kind of made things happen the way I wanted them to happen. And that was a situation I couldn't control. And that was really the first experience since leaving home at 13 that I felt that I didn't control. So there were some lessons there. The forgiveness being the largest one, because uh, um, the guy I was living with at the time was an arms dealer. He sold weapons to the police and the cartels in Miami, and he somehow found this guy. After I managed to get away from him, and it's a long story. I don't want to bore you with the gory tales, but I ran from the Everglades into the nearest town, which was Davie. I was barefoot, broken bones, covered in blood, still handcuffed behind my back. And when I escaped, it was about 4 in the morning. I ran for about an hour. It was like 5 or so. And there was no one out in the streets. One person I found on the streets to help me refused to, said he didn't want to get involved. I guess usually when we're out at 5 a.m., we're probably not up to much good. And so then he told me where there was a bar open in Hollywood, Florida, the next town over, that was open 24 hours. So I ran from Davie to Hollywood, and I went to the bar, and they refused to help me. And I told them I wasn't going anywhere until someone called the police. And I imagined that it was a little weird to see this guy come in. Just, I mean, I had some head wounds, so I was just covered in blood and handcuffed, and they probably didn't want anything to do with that. But they ended up actually literally throwing me out. Two guys picked me up by each side and threw me out into the street. And as I rolled out into the center of the road, I looked up and I saw a car coming, and I just stood in front of it and just figured they were going to stop or not. And at that particular moment, I wasn't concerned one way or the other. Um, and it turned out it was a Davie police officer who was heading from Davie to the Hollywood hospital. And he had a young lady in the back who had just been gang raped. And long story short is when I got abducted, I was in my car and there was someone in the car with me. And there was a guy who had pulled me over. He had been an employee of the Broward County Sheriff's Office and had actually been fired the night before because they caught him in the morgue having sex with bodies. But he had stolen a car from the compound and pulled me over. So they had been out looking for me. He supposedly told this person who was riding with me that he was going to arrest me on my paperwork didn't match my plate or some other bogus story, but that was the story. But so the law enforcement knew that I had been missing and they were looking for me. So this guy, I guess, put two and two together, knew who I was when he pulled over, and he told me he was going to call it in and then uncuff me, but he had to go because he had to get this girl to the hospital. And before so he called it in, then he began to uncuff me, and really before he could just about finish uncuffing me, there were police from 5 different departments: the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Highway Troopers, Davie Police, Hollywood Police, Broward County Sheriffs were all just converging on me because they had been out looking for me. So they wanted to take me to the hospital, but tell them how to get to where I was last. And I couldn't describe it, but I told them I could take them there. And they said, no, you got to go to the hospital. I said, well, I ran here. I'm pretty sure that I could take a car ride back. So we did. And he had apparently chased off after me on foot and left just a boatload of evidence behind, my ID with my blood and his fingerprints and just all the evidence they would possibly want. But they couldn't find him for a while. So they then ended up taking me to the hospital, and I had some friends that worked at the doctor's hospital in Coral Gables, Florida. So I wanted to go down there because I knew people there. And that's where they took me. I went into the emergency room and they began to clean I don't want to get too gory on it, but my back was a mess. It was a bloody mess. And they began to scrub the wounds, and it felt like Brillo pads under my skin, and I passed out. So I think I call that God's protective power. There's a pain level you can handle before he says, okay, I'm gonna help you not deal with this, and unconsciousness comes over. And so I passed out in the emergency room, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital bed, and my thumb was going like this. I had no idea what was going on. That was my first exposure to opiates. It was a morphine pump, and my thumb was trying to pump for more pain relief. And oddly enough, I never cared for opiates even then. But they did put me on a pretty heavy amount of painkillers. So when I was released from the hospital, the whole time from entering the hospital to leaving, I don't even know how long I was there. I was so medicated. And then when I got out, I went into a place to do some rehab to get well from the physical wounds. And again, just loads of pain medications. Again, remember, this is in the mid 70s, before we knew what we know now about opiates. But I didn't like that feeling at all. I felt not in control. And remember, I moved out at 13. I was living in Miami on my own, and the world I lived in, I had to have my head on a swivel, and opiates slowed me down and didn't allow for that. So I began compensating for that slowness with cocaine, because that's what was plentiful in Miami. But then, of course, drinking came in to control the cocaine. So drinking became my thing. So it was just sort of this bouncing from one thing to another, trying to find balance. And I got to say, I never really liked alcohol either, but it served a purpose. I've later since done some research. I can talk about that later. But I was what we would say high functioning for a long time. So I went ahead and I finished high school, actually with decent grades while working a full-time job. but I felt I was embarrassed because at that time, as a man, you would never admit that that happened to you. It was in the papers, unfortunately. You could still find some record of it in public records, but it was embarrassing to me as a young man. So I first, as soon as I graduated school, I moved away. I went to Gainesville, Florida, went to school up there, trying to get away and reinvent myself. So of course I picked the what at the time was known as the party university in the country, and I was at the University of Florida where there was a keg at every event or multiple kegs, and I lived that life for a while, and I went into journalism and fine arts. I became an artist, and in the art world, being intoxicated is kind of the expected. If you ever work in fine arts, it's much like Hollywood, where inebriation is kind of the standard. And so I was playing in bands, doing art, going to school, working full time, and that was all that busyness was another drug for me. It was another form of alcohol for me. It was a way to not be in my head. They had offered me counseling after the abduction, and I said, I'm fine. I mean, I got away. I got the better of this guy. He's going to spend the rest of his life in prison, and I'm free. So I thought I won. I'm good. Took a long time to figure out that wasn't a working plan. I started my own business, moved back down to the Miami area and opened it there, and was very successful. And I think that was part of the problem. I could continue to put on the veneer of everything's fine. I'm doing great. People who knew me and spent a lot of time with me knew that I was constantly under the influence. And when I say constantly, I mean from waking to bed. But I was, again, very high functioning. So as far as business went and paying bills and taking care of things like that, I was still very successful. And I think that's a curse in some ways. I often joke that eventually God took everything away because he knew I didn't do well with it. And now that I haven't had a drink since 1999, I'd like him to try me again. see how well I handle that much money today. So what happened was I knew there was something wrong. But I couldn't. I just figured that I was smart enough to figure it out myself, and that's another curse I believe a lot of us experience, is that our intellect is one of the biggest barriers to getting well. So I just kept thinking if I really wanted to stop, I would. I thought I had pretty good mind control, self-control. I was an athlete. I ran cross country. I took good care of my body, aside from putting things in it that shouldn't be in it. And I just thought I had the ability to stop if I ever really wanted to. And I did the usual things, trying to limit it to weekends, limit it to certain amounts, limit it to certain situations, hiding money from myself, you name it. I did all the things we do, and yet I couldn't stop. So my answer to that was I must just not really want to. It's a matter of will. Eventually, the reality that I was no longer in control and my will had nothing to do with it came about, and it came about in the form of a sequence of events. I lost my home. I had a fairly nice, large ranchette in Miami, and I lost it. And the way I lost it is simply not paying bills. I had the money, I just didn't pay it. Very bizarre behavior looking back, but indicative of where I was. I would work, and the whole time just staying under the influence 24/7. So while I was on remote control for the work stuff, my whole life was in shambles at home. I lived in a 5-bedroom home by myself because I couldn't have people around me. And then when I lost that home, I moved into a condo. And then when I lost the condo, I moved into a duplex. Now, keep in mind, I still got money in the bank. I'm just not making healthy decisions in life. And then I lost the duplex, And I say I moved into my mobile home for a few months. I was living in my car. I went from the 5 bedroom, 5 acre ranchette with the 3 car garage and the swimming pool with the waterfall to my car in very short order. And just completely out of control. And I kept saying, I said, God, we're going to have to do something about this, but not yet. And then one day my car got stolen. So there went that. And so now I'm about as truly homeless as you can get. And that wasn't enough. But I did find out where my car went, and I went to probably the worst part of Dade County. If anybody knows the Goulds area in a place called the Horseshoe, I went in there yelling and screaming about getting what's mine and threatening people. Now, mind you, I'm not armed and everybody else is. Um, and I walked out of there and realized I am crazy. This, what I just did and the way I'm living is completely insane. And so I should back up and say that someone had offered me an opportunity at treatment a year before that. And I went. I went and it was 30 days and it was at the time it was $40,000, and that's back in the 90s for this high-end expensive place. And it wasn't much use. Well, I'll tell you one thing that I did get out of it. There was a doctor from Holland who explained what was going on in my brain neurochemically, and it made perfect sense to me. And I asked him, I said, so what's the solution? And he looked at me and says, what? And I said, well, you just told me what's wrong with my brain. How do you fix it? He said, oh no, you don't fix it. That's just the way it is. I found that to be an unacceptable answer. The other good thing but which later led me to doing research in that area, which I now have published in molecular neurobiology magazines. But the other thing is it introduced me to the 12 steps. That was good and bad for me. What happened was I ended up at the end of that 30 days, they said, you're a pretty severe case. We think you could use 3 months. I said, sure, but they wanted another 40 grand and I had to borrow 10 of the 40 I paid them in the first place. So now I've exhausted my money, the 30 and change I had and the 10 they had, plus the extras I paid for. So now I have no money and they want more money or I have to go. So they said they would think about it over the weekend. They did, and they graduated. Suddenly I was better. It was a miracle. When I had no money, I was suddenly healed. And so I went to a 3/4 way house, but everybody there was using. There were no meetings. So they had told me 90 and 90. So I, typical alcoholic fashion, I said, I'll do 3 a day and knock this out in a month. So I went to 3 meetings a day. I picked a sponsor right away. I did all the things that they told me to do, except I didn't work the steps. I did the meeting makers make it thing, and I just showed up. And within a few weeks, they had me chairing a meeting because the chair had been taken to the hospital on an overdose. So I stepped in, and it turned out he was my roommate at the 3/4 way house. And I was stayed clean for 3 months in this environment. And then I had that burning desire, and I called my sponsor, and he says, well, I'm busy until after I have this lunch, and then I'll meet you around 2 o'clock. And this was 8 o'clock in the morning. And I'm like, I got a desire at 8 o'clock in the morning. You're telling me 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm not waiting. And I was back out and off to the races. So then I end up in this situation where I lose my car and everything. That's how I ended up truly homeless and living in my car, was spending all my money on a treatment center. So I had been introduced to the steps, but in my mind, they didn't work. Never mind that I never actually did any of the steps with anybody. I just went to meetings and found a sponsor. And when they said, find a sponsor who's got something you want, I chose the guy with a trust fund because I wanted a trust fund. I missed a lot of the finer points of what they were actually trying to tell me. So that left to a year of relapse, and that moment of realizing my insanity and getting on my knees and saying, okay, God, I give up now. So in a fashion, I guess that was my 1, 2, 3, right there in the middle of this park. And within a couple of weeks, I had found another place to go, but it was someone found it for me. It was a treatment center that I didn't know when I got there, but it was a faith-based 9-month treatment center. I was okay with faith-based, but 9 months I was not going to do. So when I walked in, they interview you and you have to agree to the 9 months. And I lied and said I would do 9 months with every intention of doing 30 days and leaving. At the end of the 30 days, I realized I wasn't ready and knew I didn't want to return to where I was. So I stayed a little longer. Well, a little longer ended up being the full 9 months. Um, I will say that it was a horrible place. It's gotten much better since, but it was a horrible place in the sense that they didn't have any structure. They didn't have any real care. It was really the value of it was being isolated from the world and not having access. So I was able to get some healing, what they call the neuroplasticity, but they didn't believe in the 12 steps. So they didn't take us to meetings. Well, I had remembered my meetings. And so when I graduated, I stayed on to work in their office as an administrative assistant. And I convinced them to let us go to meetings. And I got reintroduced to the steps. And then I kind of, again, didn't work them and just saw that there was, now I have this faith angle and now I've got these steps, and it seemed like the two are in conflict. And so they stopped taking us to the meetings. I worked there for 3 years. And during that time, went back to school. I went to seminary and graduated that. I went to, and at this, while dual enrolled at the same time, got a psych degree, which it was only a lower level at the time. I had to go back and finish that later. So we started a church for the homeless, the addicted, the sexually abused, and the mentally ill. Pretty much me, right? So, so we started a church for that group, and that church still exists today in Homestead, Florida City. But then had to move. My in-laws had cancer up in Port St. Lucie, so we came up here to be caregivers, bought the closest house to them we could find, and I finished up the psych degrees and became a counselor and started working in the treatment field. And in that process, I ran into a guy who had been sponsored by Clarence Snyder. And he said, I talked about my experience with the steps and how I hadn't actually worked them. He says, well, would you like to work the steps with me? And I said, well, I've been clean for years. I mean, I don't know what good that would do. He says, let's do it anyway. So he's since passed, but he used his full name. So I'll tell you that Jack Rapp took me through the steps the way Clarence took him through the steps. And it was a life changer. It was. Yes, I had managed to not use for years, but I didn't understand the value of the steps beyond not using. They're a prescription for life. And so he did it the way Clarence did it with him. We did it in like a day and a half. We did all 12 steps. And he used the sheet that Clarence used. He literally kept his inventory sheet that Clarence gave him to work with inside his big book. And we used his sheet as a template for my sheet. And so I did that. And I actually then joined their organization, which was what Clarence had started a series of retreats here in Florida, where he lived closer to where he lived in the Orlando area. And I joined their board and began doing weekend retreats, walking people through the steps over a weekend. And we did that for many, many years. And I just left that organization a couple of years back. And now I teach that. And that's how I walk my sponsees through the steps. I let them know. And I, with my life the way it is today, I never do more than 3 sponsees at a time. I want to be available to who I can truly be available to. And so in that process, I'll back up that I remembered that gentleman who came from Holland to tell me what was wrong with my brain. So I began doing clinical research on genetics and neurotransmitter activity as it relates to alcoholism and other addictions and other mental health concerns. And I ended up working with Dr. Kenneth Blum in that, and we got published in a multitude of peer-reviewed journals on that. And the interesting thing is that it still has no more value than the steps. I personally believe that the big book of AA is divinely inspired. That's my belief. And so now I've joined a group called the Recovery Church Movement. And what it is trying to bring, there was a time in which churches were very friendly to the 12 steps. As a matter of fact, most meetings were at churches, and so many still are. But then there's something that happened where churches began to back away because they felt that the rooms had become unfriendly to the church. And so I find myself going to the rooms, almost having to be apologetic for the church, and going to church almost having to be apologetic for the steps, when in truth, they all come from the same roots and belong together for many of us. Not necessary, but common for many of us. And so Recovery Church Movement does just that. It's a 12-step church, and we intentionally don't meet on Sundays. A few of them do, very few do, because we don't want to be a traditional church. We want to be a 12-step environment. It's sort of friendly to both. And we also encourage that anybody who joins us does not stop going to the rooms. That we see extreme value in AA and NA and all 12-step, all the fellowships. We believe in them. We support them. We're a part of them. We're just something that allows people to explore their faith at a different level. And so now I do that, and I teach that as well. We just had twice a year, we have a national leadership retreat, and we just had one up in Nashville a couple weekends ago. And so I teach at those. And then I ended up opening up another treatment center. I've opened actually dozens of them across the country, and helped start the recovery churches in several areas as well. I don't do as much research anymore. I've settled on that. I still teach some of that. I teach like the neurobiology of trauma and these kind of things, but most of my work these days in the research is with veterans and first responders. The amount of alcoholism, addiction, ideation, and other issues, PTSD amongst our veterans and first responders is tremendous. And they tend to not want to join us in the rooms because they may have just arrested you last week, right? So learning to have specialized groups for them and teaching them, and so that's certainly a lot of what I do. And I've also, as a part of the giving back, I've continued to explore my faith in that regard. And my 12-step involves more than the sponsees. So we try and find ways to encourage others to sponsor. We started a ministry in Haiti. We do a lot of work around the globe in the recovery area. I work with a few people who travel all over the world teaching the 12 steps so that people can see the value of it. I will say that learning how Clarence did things, and I've done a lot of research. I have a whole thesis on the origins and the root of AA and the history of it. And a lot of you are familiar with Dick B's work, and I spent some time with him before his passing, and his son Richard has taken over that. And he used to be doing some things with us at the retreats that Clarence started. So that's kind of where I am today. That's a quick wrap up of that. I mean, I'm very happy to open to questions and anything that you have. I mean, I could certainly go on talking about me for quite some time. What I will say is that being sober was one thing. Having worked the steps and having that spiritual experience is a whole nother thing. And I'm very happy that Jack took the time to invest in me, and that Clarence took the time to invest in him so that I could have the life I have today. Questions, comments, snide remarks?